Hello, Luke. How are you?
Fine, thank you, Steve. And you?
I'm doing okay. I'm hanging in there post-vaccine shot, so we'll see
Yeah.
if I can if I survive a live stream. But uh, thank you for joining me today. It is
You're
your
welcome.
evening, my kind of early day still, and I wanted to have a conversation with you about automated testing in Business Central. And obviously, you are the expert in our Business Central community on automated testing. So I wanted to share with everyone about your book, your work around automated testing, and also very selfishly ask you a few questions based on my experience so far trying to implement and use automated testing in Business Central and get your thoughts and recommendations about how to best do that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, excellent. So, first of all, let's see. What button are we here? Okay, so let me figure out my studio here. So, tell us what you are up to these days. I have so many email addresses and URLs for you that I can't keep track of all your projects. So, how would you describe what you're working on these days?
Um, well, in general, I was, I think, challenged a couple of times by others too. What the heck are you doing? What's the red thread through all of this? And maybe that's a nice thing to start with. For me, it's about helping people to get things done. That's in general. Specifically, I'm teaching a lot, and if you look at the URL, the one at the top, it was nice a couple of years ago that the extension training was available. That's very clear. So there we are training juniors. The second one is Areopa Academy, where we have been organizing some seminars in the past, but recently it's the webinars, the two bi-weekly webinars I'm doing, and the second one is part of that. The third one is actually related directly to my blog and is officially the name of my company too. And then the last one is a Dutch organization where we organize well, every quarter, roughly an evening with presentations. So a lot of things is about education and sharing. Next to that, I'm a programmer and a tester, automated testing programming, and that's what I'm doing part time also for a part time employer. So you could say the red thread is sharing, helping people out, and next to that, doing some projects.
Very cool. Well, one of the big projects that you did a few years ago, let me switch here, is your book, Automated Testing in Dynamics 365 Business Central. And this has been available through Packt Publishing, through the Packt website. And as soon as I learned about it, I learned about it a little after it was released, I believe. But as soon as I learned about it, I bought the hard copy and I bought the electronic version through my Pack subscription. And I believe I've read through the entire thing and read through at least half of it twice and introduced it to my team. And we've talked about how we absolutely, is my belief at least, how we absolutely need to have automated testing in our development practices with Business Central. And it's a huge contrast for me in the world I come from, which I'll mention later. But thank you for writing this book because I've been doing development, right? Coding development, whatever you call it, for, I mean, gosh, well over 25 years. And I'm aware of the concept of testing and automated testing, and .NET has a way of creating tests in a separate project. But I have never participated in a project or work with anyone who has implemented automating testing as a practice. And
Mm-hmm.
so this, maybe it's more common in the enterprise level, but in the small business, get it done, quick projects, smaller budgets, I just have not had the time to come up to speed with that. Do you do you see that distinction in different customers or different environments, enterprise, or I believe you worked with Microsoft, right? So have you seen that less in the mid-market space?
Well, that's a bit difficult to give a generic answer on, because I've been in the Dynamics 365 Business Central or Navision world for over 20 years now, and I've never stepped outside of that. So my perspective is directly linked to that, and it's typically not a world where automated testing did have a place, and that's partly due to the fact that the technology did not support it. And yes, I know that there were people probably also coming from other places working with test automation that tried visual tests, so generic tools that could steer the interface, the user interface, and then let's say you could record or whatever. But in general, that leads back to what you just said or mentioned of smaller projects, get the things fastly done. I think that's also the past where many in the Business Central world come from, where Navigator, what was the older name of it? In that time, it was actually a software application allowing accountants, bookkeepers to do their work and also add something to it so that they could program, go in the background with a little bit of technical insight or overview or Darren's or whatever. And it slowly grew into becoming spread around the world, used by bigger companies, used by implementers to do their work. But let's say being a mature development community, that's something that's only happening the last decade, roughly, or 5 years even. Yeah, so many of us, me included, were there more or less like, okay, we know that we dare to program, we know a bit about programming, and yes, we're technical, we can do the things, but well, things like source code management. I was one of the first to more or less start to advocate it when I left Microsoft. And it took a long time before that started to pick up. And you could say with the extension development, AL, having the source outside of the system and only deploying it inside to the system started to accelerate the use of source code management. And the same applies to test automation, I think.
Okay, that's good context to have. As I'm switching from the Dynamics GP and .NET development world, it's almost as if this has always existed, right? So for me, it's like, wow, I've never used all these tools. So, but to your point, it hasn't always existed. It is relatively new for many people. So that's good to hear. Well, I am personally very excited to have the tool available. One, a native automated test tool and framework in the platform. And as you mentioned, source code control. We now have Git, we now have Azure DevOps, we have pipelines, and all of these pieces really work together to produce, a DevOps lifecycle for an application. So. Now, I have a screenshot of the book and the table of contents, and the beginning of your book really emphasizes the why, the story behind automated testing. It doesn't just assume that the reader has the background as to the why, and I think that was very important. I was reading the first few chapters like, oh my gosh, it's so obvious now, right? But without that, I hadn't really recognized the suffering I was going through with my manual testing. So I'd produce a new build, I'd have to go through all these steps to prep my test data, process manual tests. And as I'm reading your book, I'm thinking, of course, it makes absolute sense. Yes, there's upfront cost to setting that up, but the downstream benefits and cost reduction, it's obvious to me as a developer. And so I suppose some of this conversation is for project managers, non-developers, finance folks in the organization as to how you sell this as an offer to help with development projects.
True, fully true. A different way of saying it also is that I think it applies to everything what a development team does, but specifically test automation. It's a team effort. It's something that influences everybody, of course, but it also should be supported, carried by everybody. There's let's say, of course, a tester knows better how to approach the thing, how to attack the system under test. But the input of everybody else is also very important. It's like, say, two pairs of eyes always see more than one. Whatever.
And that is an excellent segue, because that is one of the core topics that I wanted to ask you about today. And on to the next slide here, I grabbed a definition of acceptance test driven development, which is one name that is used in the automated testing world for a particular type of test concept or test practice. And it says it involves team members with different perspectives. You have the customer, you have development, you have testing, collaborating to write acceptance tests in advance of implementing the functionality. And for those of us developers who get rough specs and just start banging away on code, this is a very different mindset, right? This is like, whoa, wait, you want me to write tests before I write code? How does that work? And it really is, it requires a reversal of thought. I've been working for years in the code first, test second mindset, and this does require real retraining. But to your point, it involves the team. And that is what I'll follow up with in questions. So excellent point. Customer, development, testing, and the different perspectives they bring to that conversation.
True. And to add a small, let's say, story from my history, over 8 years now, I joined a company, end user company, and I was more or less, stepped in as a quality assurance guy, but as on the NAV side, they needed a developer. I was more or less swapped into it. And one of the first things I did, and I completed that over the weekend, I was at work on Monday morning, and there were quickly people standing at my desk telling that something was wrong. What often happens is that people start to point, hey, what the heck did you do? But the funny thing was, it wasn't that way. They were at my desk because there was a problem and we needed to solve the problem. Period. Yeah.
Excellent.
Of course, they asked me, do you know about it? What did you do? But it was not to mock me, but it was to get me on or get everybody involved to get it solved. And that's one of the, I think, major things, and it's not always easy. Also, just talked a little bit upfront with you about a new company I joined. I need to learn their way of doing. But I always try to look at it. Yes, of course, I can mock somebody. I can be a bit angry about it, but I know in the end that it happened because he or she is playing that role. It's not because they're screwed up something, is that because they were the ones that needed to implement it. And probably, as I think we all know or should know, that often if a bug pops up, it's a high probability that it originates in the specs already. It's not that somebody implemented something wrong, so used the wrong tool or the wrong screw or whatever, but it's the definition of what they needed to do was already wrong. So and from that perspective, I put always stress on it's a team effort, and especially with testing and test automation even more. If the team is not involved, I think you will have a hard time to get it successful.
And that I 100% agree with. I am working with my team to develop requirements, specifications, design, and how do we implement this. And as part of that discussion, I want to be able to test. So I want to bring in my team early on, the entire organization, to work to develop the test, not just the developer or myself. And to that end, I have a few questions. So, for instance, how do I involve non-developers in the testing process? These could be folks from the functional side, the QA side, the business side, the sales side even, the people who are understanding the client concerns or the customer concerns and what they're trying to accomplish. The sooner I can get them on board to participate with the testing process, I think the easier, because by the time we get specs, we develop it, it's often difficult to go back to rewrite those test scripts. So I'd like to get those like, oh, you heard a requirement. What is the corresponding test for that? ATDD, right? And then based on the test, let's develop against that test. And that's what I'm thinking. And then the follow-on questions I will have here, the balance of testing features versus catching bugs. I think there's a QA mindset that I need to catch the bug. I need to find that weird data entry error that causes that error. And my impression is that's not necessarily the goal of ATDD. It may be a side effect, but that isn't necessarily the primary conversation, perhaps. And then I have questions about how many tests I should write and dealing with variations of tests and how many tests that represents and how to structure them. So if you're ready for some Q&A here, here we go. Okay. So involving, go ahead.
Yeah, to the first question. So how to involve non-developers? I would make it just anybody in the team, of course, should get involved. An important thing I think here is that something I've explicitly started to talk about, exclaim this way last fall, is that in the end, for software implementation, software development is creating behavior. So a software application is implemented behavior. There is a customer wish. From that, you get requirements detailing out what are exactly the parts of this customer wish. And from that, in the end, the only thing we have implemented is behavior. A developer implements the behavior. What does a tester do? Or what does testing do? Is check that behavior. Is the behavior what is expected by the customer or led from the customer wish into this implementation? Then from that, getting back to your first question, how do you get non-developers or the team involved in the testing process? Is that if we are going to implement behavior, we need to check whether that behavior is the expected behavior. That's it.
Got it.
By the way, currently working on the second edition of the book. The old version is next to me. An old colleague, a former colleague, and he's also one of the reviewers, mentioned, and it was funny. Some time ago, I had a similar thought. He said, test automation is actually not automated tests, but automated checks. You're checking something, because that's the only thing you can do with automated tests. For the involvement of everybody, you need to have functional people to understand the customer wish, and from that, deduct behavior. How is the system going to behave? And ATDD, and you have also BDD, business, what is it? Driven development, whatever. But it's in the end, the only thing you can describe with ATDD, or I think BDD also, is behavior. I put A in, I get B out if I do something in between. And then the check is, did we get a B? Yeah? And if we put C in, do we get a D? So that's part of it. We need to define that. and everybody in the team can be involved there. A tester knows probably better what details are needed, but also my experience of the last couple of years is not only myself, but also some peer developers, is as a developer, you get a better discussion with everybody, because now you know as a developer, it needs to behave this way. Wait, but now I program it, but it doesn't behave this way. What did I do wrong? Oh, sorry, the product owner says, I forgot a detail. Yeah, so sidestep. I don't know, it's behind me here. I don't know if you know this book. And stupidly I put a blur on, but a bit like this. I think you were on my session last year, last fall. Yeah.
There it is.
And that's a different way of saying. It's not testing behavior. It doesn't say it does. The guy who wrote it, Atsik, he really tries to use words that are not that don't have connotation like test-driven development. Some people's hair stand straight up, but he talks about examples. You need examples. Specifications, I think, always tend or come from a conceptual description. Yeah, tend to be or come from, and that's needed because that allows us to easily talk about things. If we would only be able to describe behavior, it becomes a big collection of things, and maybe it doesn't show to have relations in between. That's why I think concepts are good, etc. But as soon as you only hand off concepts to a developer, they start to, or he or she starts to interpret it and say and thinks, oh yeah, this is the way it should behave. No, you need to hand off a description of the behavior, being, in this case of the book, examples. How does it act? Well,
and I can relate to two of those points, both of those points. One is by example. That's a great idea, that rather than me trying to have a functional person attempt to write a technical specification about fields or records or anything like that, just say, hey, the user sits down, wants to enter this transaction in this manner, goes about their business in the context of that example. I think that's a great way to bring in the functional folks and not force them to write a technical example. And to the, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I think you're not a professional organization if functional people are going to write technical descriptions. Then you disrespect the intellect, the ability of the developer. And I've been called upon a project years ago where they asked me, could you help to improve our developers' work? But what I found out was actually exactly that. What was handed up to the developers? A technical description, which was, let's say, not perfect. Yeah. And then they started to implement it, and then what got out of it was judged by the people that gave them that design and told them that that was not what they expected it to be. No, there's no dialogue, there's no involvement. It's just conveyor belt work. You get this, and so the team involvement in every aspect. So if you would have a list, and you might know from the course you were part of that I'm using this Excel with ATTD, that list will never be complete. Surely not at the start. Everybody needs to review and add things to it. They find holes. And in that way, there's lesser possibility to interpretation.
And the second point, I totally agree with that. The second point, which I think is related, is you mentioned the software is intended to, I believe you used the term behavior. It's supposed to produce a certain behavior. And I have had many cases where a request was given to a developer, please code this. Technically, they followed the letter of that request. They produced code that did that. but it was not developed in the context of an overall behavior. The developer didn't know that context.
Yeah.
It wasn't his or her fault. They delivered exactly what was requested, but as soon as a real world person tests it in the context of their business process, it failed. And it's like, oh, I didn't know that the user would be doing X, Y, and Z prior to doing this test or this operation. I didn't have that context. So it was a lack of that overall context, which involved lots of, background listening and context. And it's like, oh, how do we communicate what is needed to the developer so that it's not a back and forth with 100 iterations to do something correctly? So
the simplest thing for me is that every developer should always refer back to the customer's wish. I always try. I'm not saying I'm always succeeding, because I'm sometimes detached from the customer, too far away off. But everything you do should always revert to the customer's wish. So any decision you make, any path you follow has to relate to that. And if you give a technical description, let's say what you roughly just described, that's leading to something detached, which doesn't relate anymore to the customer's wish.
Got it. Excellent. Well, so how do one of the questions I have in the context of this is, how do I involve the non-developers in the testing process? And so I will show one attempt to kind of produce conversation and discuss as a team, how do we come up with these acceptance test-driven development scenarios based on customer wishes? And I'm trying to come up with something very simple such that we all have the context of what that means. In the case, the context is Business Central, but for example, default customer number. This is an attempt to try and have a very simple example, and I just put this into Word. Allow the user to specify the number series to be used for new customers. That's my scenario. Then, given the sales and receivables setup page, given a valid number series, when a number series is entered on the setup page, then the number series is saved in the setup table. Is that meaningful as a basic example to communicate with a team?
Well, the challenge here is the two sides to it. Yes, it's a clear description. There's always then some skepticism from people that need to get involved. Do we need to get down to this detail? Yes. So if that skepticism is there, don't go too deep in that sense. I think I know you shared some of your questions already up front, and I think there was one part that relates also to this. How deep do you go? And this looks more like what I would call a unit test. It's a simple, small thing. The Business Central world, and I don't know exactly the context of your team, but let's say maybe it applies to ERP in general. The testing has long time been done manually only. Yeah, and what kind of testing is that? Functionality related, integration testing in the sense of going through the application from one side to the other. And so that's also a kind of integration. What path can you follow, and does it work right? I always tend, and also in the book, I'm not clear cutting in between, but I'm often referring to the functional side, because that's in our world what our experience, our daily practice links to. Yeah. So in that case, this specific one, that test you just showed, is maybe a bit too small, a bit too like, okay, we're first going to check whether all the nuts and bolts are still okay, while we actually want to know whether the whole car is working or not. Yeah.
Got it.
So to get the whole team involved, don't make it too, well, atomistic,
granular, too atomic.
too granular. Yeah.
Okay.
That's one side. Yeah.
Excellent.
But on the other side, you don't make it too big, because that means the one who's going to program it, it takes one day before they have one scenario set. Yeah. By the way, the learning curve is often, for me, that's my experience with new features, that before I have a first test implemented, it might take already half a day. And then after that, once I get, but that's getting in shape, you could say. And then after that, the next test is done in a much shorter time. And then at the end of the day, I might even have 20 tests or 10 tests set up. Yeah.
Got it. So, in this example, this is probably too granular, too field level, too low level for discussion with the functional team. The functional team might say, create a new customer. And one of our internal unit tests at the development level would be, okay, we need to be able to get the next customer number, but the functional team just kind of assumes that that is taken care of.
True. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Very helpful.
And by the way, this is a nice example also, like learning test automation, but also later on, if you're experienced starting up with a new feature, but not knowing exactly the way, those kind of tests make sense. Do I, at a lower level, get things working? That's what unit test is about. However, once you go higher and integrate the different units, you get an overall test that, like, well, in your example, not checking the number creation, but checking that you can create a new customer with a new unique number.
Right.
That entails also the one at the bottom. You might decide to throw away that unit test kind of thing, because the overall one is also covering. Running all those tests is actually duplicating something, so that is also a part of managing your test collateral.
Got it. So I could potentially replace these two tests with create customer, and if that create customer succeeds, and if we know it got a customer number, and we know that customer number came from the default number series, then we've covered our bases. And only if we encounter an issue might we need to backtrack with a smaller test to check dependencies.
True.
Fantastic.
If this functionality, this number series functionality, a standard feature in Business Central, if that needs to undergo a basic redesign, but these parts still needs to work, so that those granular tests are still usable, because then just change some things and see that that part is still working. You don't need to know then whether that customer can be created, because number series is also used in other parts. It's for more things. So yes, perfectly.
Okay, very good. That's very helpful for me. So I will move the discussion to a higher level with the functional team, so that we're not at the record level, the field level, these unit tests, and that concept escaped me at the time, but it makes complete sense when you explain it. Excellent. So next challenge that I'm seeing in our discussions, I have our functional folks are used to QA, like a traditional manual QA operation. Can I break the application? And it is fascinating to watch that mindset. It's like, okay, you just delivered this to me. I'm not going to do a happy path scenario. I'm going to try to break your code, right? And what I'm finding that results in is, okay, what bizarre value can I enter into this field to break it and find a bug? And correct me if I'm wrong, but that isn't necessarily the primary focus of ATDD. Is that accurate to say? Because ATDD I think of as, here is your customer wish, here's your scenario, let's code against it. Yes, there may be bugs, and we'll need to add some tests to backfill on that unit test to do boundary checking, things like that. But when I want to have a conversation with my team about customer wish, request, scenario, ATDD script, it's not about finding bugs in this date field.
It in the end, it's you could say, yeah, I don't know how you phrase it at the start, but testing is not a synonym for finding bugs. Of course not.
Okay, excellent.
Testing is, and whether you call it testing or checking, and testing would be if a human being is doing tests, it's not just checking, it's trying to find ways, if they're try ways, and if they are valid, do they work out well? And part of that is actually the abnormal side of the behavior. Yeah. So if you call just now the boundary, checking the boundary, that should be part of your testing. What is, I think in the book I mentioned it also, one of the things with requirements, except for the conceptual description, is that it's often only describing the happy path or the sunny path. Yeah,
got it.
Which makes sense. I mean, the customer wants to do this to get out that. The customer is not asking for, if I deviate 1,000%, I want to have a warning. Yeah, in general. But it's part of the behavior. I mean, the boundaries are always there. I'm actually a physics engineer. So in the physical world and in simulation of the physical world, the boundaries are very important. What happens if something flows through space? There is no friction on the sideway. But in normal life, if you blow something through a room, there are walls, and the air sticks to the walls, which makes the flow inside not as free as you might think. Well, that also applies to software. Well, another way of saying it, how do you make it hooligan proof? So if a hooligan sits down, and a hooligan is for me also a positive word for just somebody trying to do something, but actually doing something which was not intended to happen. Nobody thought of it, but every user, me included with the software I'm using, is a hooligan because they always deviate from the requirements. Yeah. So part of your tests should be to identify the rainy path, as they call it. Yeah. Where does it deviate from the happy path?
Got it. Okay. So I guess the successful completing the process successfully is your base test, but you will need to consider the exceptions, the warnings, the errors, the invalid data scenarios. And I guess in my experience, most of the emphasis on QA I've seen is on the breaking stuff, and it's not so much on the earlier scenarios and ATDD script to make the base use case workable. But so got it. Okay, so in this slide, I just said, okay, we want to create a sales invoice, or we want to assign a value to a custom field in a customer table extension. And while we code that, I'm finding the QA is like, okay, how can I break this? What bizarre value? And the problem I guess I have with breaking it is there are so many ways to potentially break a given field, a given record, a given application that I'm trying to contain that initial discussion. Like, okay, I don't want to spend 16 hours coding tests for bizarre edge cases and boundary conditions, because that can get very expensive when a user may never think of it. Yeah. My philosophy is, let me add 2 or 3 basic obvious error conditions, and I hand the code over to the user, and I see what error conditions they come up with. It's like, oh, I didn't think of that. In a million years of creating fake tests to break this, I would have never thought of that scenario. So great. Now that you found it, let me add a test for that scenario and I'll handle that with boundary conditions.
There's one major flaw in this thought.
Okay.
Let's go back to what is software? It's behavior.
Okay.
Yeah? We need to implement behavior. So we need to define upfront what the behavior is. Yeah, anything which let's say in the context of a QA mind, trying to break it, which is too confined anyway, but nevertheless, still then, it's not about trying to break it. If we define upfront what are the examples, what are the ATDD scripts, what are the scenarios, as they call it, yeah? What are the scenarios? That's what describing, okay, this is what that piece of software should do. That's a scenario A. Oh, B, this is also what it should do. It starts to become multidimensional. Okay. It's not just one behavior, it's multiple behaviors. It's a strange word, behaviors of one thing, but that's what it's making the whole thing. Yeah. So if you take it from that side, what you initially try to do is verify, does it have all those behaviors? And actually going back to it's a team effort, that making up that list might be the first responsibility of a tester or a functional consultant. But that list should be shared by the whole team to review it. Hey, you say this is scenario, this is a scenario. Hey, but didn't you forget that scenario? What happened if we do that? Oh, yeah, but that's not allowed. Okay, but then it's a scenario because it's a behavior that should not happen. Yeah.
Okay.
So that way you draw up slowly a full set of behaviors for the system. Yeah. So that's the first part of the, let's say,
got it.
Pointing to a flaw in your thoughts. It's not that somebody delivers something and now we're going to break it. No, it's something we all together have thought up. Yeah, it's not a tester now hand it over to the tester, to the magician or to the I don't know what witch or whatever, and they know to do their specifics. No, they were part of that story up front already, and then yes, still the testing gets more room once you got automated checks. Then you really, next to that, still are going to find out what happens if we deviate, because the hooligans will do that. Yeah, and again, I don't mean hooligans disrespectful. It's just a way of doing things different than others do. So,
to your point, I think that's an excellent point. If my QA tester enters a date of January 1st, 1700, and that causes a problem, and we say, wait a minute, we can't handle every single boundary condition in the universe, it really is a gap in our test scenarios in that we didn't discuss the boundaries of date fields. So we should have discussed that and said, okay, for this date field, an acceptable boundary is a date greater than or equal today and less than or equal 30 days in the future. And if it falls outside of that boundary, that is outside of our business use case, our business process, and therefore we need to constrain that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know what you mentioned yourself, we hand it off to a customer to let them come up with other errors. That will still happen. I mean, even with a team of bright people, there is a black hole somewhere. Yeah. Something we haven't looked at. But preferably try to at least define that we haven't looked at that. And then you can prioritize and say, like, more or less you said it also, the chance that this is going to happen is very small, but we have pinpointed it. And we can still say we're not going to do anything about it. We take a certain risk, but we think it's very small. We're not going to spend a lot of time and money on it because that will leave less money and time for the rest. So we park it somewhere and maybe nobody ever touches it, then it's fine. But maybe within a certain time, somebody comes around and asks us, why is this not working? Well, you can tell why. And that's already a good thing. If you can tell them, we know that this is not a scenario. We deliberately did not include it. But yes, now you're asking and you're trying and it's not working. That's the reason. And now you have a reason to fill up that gap.
Got it. So I'm now looking at these scenarios like validate, quantity, and this is not so much a test to break the application. It's more of an opportunity to discuss how do we design the application to properly handle these scenarios. And it's not just an automated test script that we write. It's also the code designed in the application to just handle these by default. And so, we've got it handled. Great, test away. Knock yourself out. We have discussed dates. We've discussed quantities. Therefore, they should be able to handle these edge cases.
True.
Excellent. Excellent. Very cool. So, next question here. Testing design and what lack of a better term, I'm calling parameterization. So the concept is, okay, we have a test scenario to create an invoice, a sales invoice, for example, and we do that test and that process works great. We are all happy, but then we get a Canadian customer, a UK customer, a Spain customer, a Japan customer, and we realize that an invoice is not an invoice. It's an invoice in the US, it's an invoice in the UK, and those may have different scenarios. Maybe it's an addressing thing, maybe it's a VAT thing, maybe it's a language or localization issue. So being a developer, I don't want to rewrite the same code 10 times, right? I can see how this could expand from 1 country to 5 countries to 10 countries to handle some nuances of each country, locality, whatever the case is. Is it a valid test architecture to have, say, a parameterized test such that I have a create invoice procedure that accepts parameters, say one of those parameters is country? Is that a better design than create sales invoice procedure, create UK invoice procedure?
The Germans would say jein, yes and no, ja and
nein.
There's 2 sides to this. Of course, generalization of any product is something within a certain context you want to strive for. The way I've learned programming, although I wasn't educated as a specific programmer. I started programming as part of my physics study, but I learned that you can start reusing parts by making functions, etc. However, what I also learned in the last decade, getting involved with test-driven development, is that on Dynamics conference from last fall, I've forgotten her name, but she did that was the woman, that entrepreneur that worked on fashion and clothing in Africa, etc.
Donna Sarkar.
And what she said relates exactly to this. Make the special things, and over time you will find out the generic things. Don't work the other way around. Don't go and making clothes that fits everybody. No, somebody has interest in your work, and they want specifically this and that. Make it for them. And then another one has, and all of a sudden you find out there are generics. That's things they share. And the same thing, that's what test-driven development also is about. Make it, fake it till you make it. Get it done as fast as possible. And part of test-driven development is also this red-green refactor mantra, where you write a test, you don't have app code. That's a strange thing for many developers, for me too at that time. But the test cannot succeed because there's nothing to test yet. So to get the test working, you might need to build some app code, the application code, and then it works. But it works for that specific situation. If you need, as your first test, to verify that the number of lines is 1, you have a function not checking the number of lines, but just returning 1. Your test succeeds. But then you have a second test, which tells you you should now write it. You have now a test. You write a test that checks that there are 2 lines. Well, the same function returning just a 1, really a hard-coded 1, will not work anymore because it cannot all of a sudden return a 2. And then you're starting to write code that really looks at the number of lines. So by being very specific, going to more generic, so more individual specifics. I hadn't thought of that one, but somebody is calling now, and it's almost never happening. So the only thing I can do now, sorry, is to step out.
No
and
problem.
Take
No
the
problem. Welcome to live streaming, folks. This is real.
That's when your office is in the kitchen. Sorry for
yes, that. No problem.
So from the specifics, you start to generalize. And one of the trade-offs of test-driven development is that you will never build more than it's wanted. So if you would pick the other way around, which I also was educated in, think about how you could use this for more situations, yeah, not only for this specific situation. So what are you going to start to build? A very generic function, which probably solves what you need, but does much more, and maybe even errors out on things what was not intended to happen at all. So more and more nowadays, myself too, I'm very fast getting to a solution for the first cases, and slowly it grows into a mature framework, a mature whatever, but it doesn't do more than it's needed at that time.
Excellent, thank you. So I think I can relax about this for now and say, hey, we're going to start with a sales invoice with the background and context, and we're just going to assume it's a US, because I'm in the US, that's what I know. It's a US specific invoice, and let's just be clear that we understand that it is a US invoice and that we may encounter some discrepancies or issues with other countries, other languages, other tenant environments, etc. And at that time, great. We can add test 2 or 3 or 4 for those specifics. And then at some point we can say, is it time, have we learned enough to refactor this into a general solution to create an invoice for these types of scenarios and environments that we're testing against?
True. Yeah.
I think that's a great idea.
So the parameterization will come around when it's needed. So first you have your invoice. What again? First you have your invoice for US, and then Spain comes around. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent.
This is funny. I dropped
You're
the phone
a popular
somewhere.
man.
No, yeah, well.
Okay. And related to that, Henrik Helgeson has commented on the stream. He makes a very good point. Test code units are ever changing, and that's okay. And, excellent point. Just as we sometimes need to refactor code, we need to refine, update, add new tests, and refactor our tests. So,
true.
And I do that today in the .NET world, but mine are not automated tests. They're actually, I think of them as validations when my application runs. So I may have 5 validations. The customer discovers a scenario that isn't covered, or the data pops up that causes an error. I add test validation number 6 or 7 or 10. All my framework is there. And to your point, when I find 5 that have a common pattern, it's like, maybe I need to consolidate this into a more general validation and handle these 5 simultaneously. So I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, any other closing thoughts? other than get started with automated testing in Business Central?
Of course, I mean, the proof is eating the pudding, so you have to go and do it and
Yeah.
not talk a lot about it. But
Yeah.
the thing is, one of the major thing which surprises me every time again is that you might think that your goal is to get test automation in place, enabling to quicker get things validated. Yeah, so the things you already know, but you need to verify after a change whether those things are still working like you expect it to be. That's the validation or the checking part. But due to that, new things come around. Like I think I mentioned already, you get different discussions with the product owner. As a developer, you know now, you get a description of the behavior. So you can implement it and you can already verify what you against that have been implemented as application behavior. Yeah. Often nowadays, or still nowadays, in our world, it's a bit throwing over the fence. I've done my app coding, and now people should test it. Or okay, I need to do some testing as a developer, but I need to ask my functional colleague. And as there's a website integrated with the whole thing, they need to do a round trip, and only 30 minutes later you can do your test, whatever. So it speeds up things, true. But what people don't realize is that you as a developer gets more in the know of the functionality. That's one thing. The whole team gets more in the know of the functionality. You as a developer also find out that just implementing, thinking that you did implement it is not enough. You need to verify it. Next to that, the whole thing of pipelining comes into play. There is, it's not just being able to do things faster and as such maybe build more features. There are other things coming around. Let's say Alice in Wonderland is opening another door and new things are becoming available. And that's one of the things people, and me myself too, I find it hard to sell that. But I know by my experience right now that it's not just a gimmick or, well, let's get the testing done. No, it's part of the whole process. It's part of setting up your requirements already. And that, well, I'm searching still for words.
I think to that point, there are two scenarios. One is regression testing. In addition to the primary testing to make sure your functionality is in place, I find I spend a tremendous amount of time on regression testing. So when I make a change, I need to repeat all of my manual tests just to make sure I didn't break something because of the unintended consequences of a particular interaction, right? And related to that, particularly in the Business Central world, we know that Microsoft is rapidly churning out new versions of Business Central. We need to make sure that even they have had small changes that they didn't think would have consequence, and it did because build pipeline stopped working. And I've seen Waldo say, hey, what's going on here? What did you change? And the response was, oops, we didn't realize that would be a breaking change for you. And so they were completely unrelated to the change Business Central made, but it exposed an interaction that was not anticipated. So it was really important to have those base tests in place.
Yeah, true.
Excellent. Well, so I know that you are working on a new version of your book. Is there an estimated release date, or is that known yet?
There is a whole plan in place. Okay. I have to deliver the last part on the 8th of August, something.
Okay.
We're ahead of time, not that much yet, but we're moving quite nicely, but it's going to be extended. It's now 9 chapters with 2 appendices, and it will be 13 chapters. So we're going to extend the Appendix A now, where I elaborate a little bit on test-driven development, where I deliberately did not mention in the book, will become a separate chapter, chapter 2, and we're going to have 3 other chapters covering some additional things, new things.
Excellent.
And the rest is partly also rewritten, adding some new insights to it. So yeah.
So it should be available. Like this will be the second edition. Should be available, say, by late this year or end of the year.
I think it will. It might even be before fall.
Oh wow!
Excellent. I don't have a date of the release, but recalling from the previous version, it might be quite fast after when I have delivered the last part.
Fantastic! Excellent. Yeah. Well, I love the first edition, and I will look forward to purchasing the second edition and having my team come up to speed. So we are big fans. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it very much, and have a great day.
You too. Thank you very much, and stay healthy.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining.